April 15th, 1968. The afternoon sun streamed through the dusty windows of the 28th Precinct, casting long shadows across Detective Frank Morrison's cluttered desk. In his weathered hands he held two pieces of paper that represented the crossroads of his entire career. His gold detective's badge caught the light in his left hand, while his retirement paperwork sat crisp and official in his right. 20 years, 2 full decades of walking Harlem's unforgiving streets, chasing shadows through tenement hallways and back-alley numbers joints. 20 years pursuing one man with the determination of Captain Ahab hunting his white whale. And after all those years, all those sleepless nights, all those dead-end investigations, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was still walking free through the neighborhood he ruled like an unofficial mayor. Captain Murphy approached Morrison's desk, his heavy footsteps echoing in the nearly empty squad room. Murphy had been expecting a bitter farewell speech, the kind of resentful retirement rant that defined burned-out cops who'd spent their careers tilting at windmills. Instead, what Morrison said next would echo through NYPD corridors for generations to come. "Cap, I gotta tell you something that's been eating at me for months now." Bumpy Johnson, was the finest adversary I ever had the privilege to face. Those words, spoken with the quiet conviction of a man who'd learned hard truths through harder experience, would become the stuff of police academy legend. What unfolded between April 12, 1948, and that spring afternoon in 1968 wasn't your typical cops and robbers story. This was something far more complex, far more nuanced than the black and white morality tales that filled the newspapers. This was a 20-year chess match between two intelligent men on opposite sides of the law, a game of mutual respect disguised as professional antagonism, a pursuit that fundamentally changed both the hunter and the hunted. This is the extraordinary story of how Bumpy Johnson transformed his most determined enemy into his most unlikely ally. How a young cop's burning quest for vengeance evolved into the most sophisticated relationship in New York City's criminal history. And how the detective who swore a sacred oath to destroy Bumpy ended up understanding him more intimately than anyone else alive, including members of Bumpy's own organization. Because what Frank Morrison discovered during those 2 decades of relentless pursuit wasn't simply who Bumpy Johnson really was beneath the carefully constructed legend. Morrison discovered who he himself had become in the process of that hunt, and that revelation would send shockwaves through every level of the New York Police Department. To truly understand the obsession that consumed Morrison's career, you need to go back to April 12, 1948, the day that changed everything and set two remarkable men on a collision course that would define both their lives. Officer Frank Morrison was 23 years old, fresh-faced and idealistic, just 6 months removed from the police academy. He walked his beat in Harlem, alongside Detective Jimmy O'Malley, a 15-year veteran of the force, who'd become something of a father figure to the younger man. O'Malley was old-school Irish Catholic, tough as the Hell's Kitchen streets that raised him, but possessed of a fairness and wisdom that had earned him respect throughout the community. For months, O'Malley had been patiently teaching Morrison the unwritten rules of effective policing in Harlem, lessons they don't cover in any academy textbook. How to distinguish between genuine predators and desperate people just trying to survive in an unforgiving economic landscape. How to earn authentic respect from the community without demanding fear through intimidation. How to navigate the incredibly complex relationship between law enforcement and a neighborhood that had every historical reason to view cops with suspicion and hostility. "Listen here, kid," O'Malley had explained that very morning as they walked their usual route past the brownstones and corner markets. "Harlem ain't nothing like those pristine neighborhoods downtown where the politicians and newspaper editors live. People here got their own rules, their own sense of justice, their own way of handling problems when the official system lets them down. Sometimes the guy running numbers on the corner is putting more food on family tables than the city welfare office ever has. You gotta understand the difference between someone who's wrong and someone who's truly evil." Morrison was learning, slowly but surely. He genuinely liked O'Malley's thoughtful approach to community policing. He was beginning to see Harlem not as enemy territory to be conquered, but as a vibrant community with its own internal logic, its own respected leaders, its own methods for maintaining order when the outside world failed to provide basic services and opportunities. That perspective, that growing understanding and empathy, died violently at exactly 3:47 p.m. on April 12, 1948. They were responding to reports of a disturbance at Marcus Garvey Park, the kind of call that could mean anything from a domestic dispute to something far more serious. Radio chatter indicated possible gunshots, maybe a robbery gone wrong. When Morrison and O'Malley arrived at the scene, they found a crowd of perhaps 50 people gathered in a tight circle around two motionless bodies lying on the spring grass. Both victims were young black men, probably in their early 20s, well-dressed in the style of policy runners, the foot soldiers of Harlem's extensive numbers racket. Both had been shot execution-style, professional hits that spoke to organized criminal activity rather than random street violence. O'Malley surveyed the scene with the experienced eye of a detective who'd worked hundreds of similar cases. "This is a turf war, Morrison," he said grimly. "Somebody's making a play for Bumpy Johnson's territory, and these boys got caught in the crossfire." Morrison had heard the name whispered in precinct hallways and neighborhood barbershops. Bumpy Johnson, Harlem's undisputed numbers king, a figure who commanded respect and fear in equal measure throughout Upper Manhattan. But this was Morrison's first direct encounter with the violence that could erupt around Bumpy's criminal empire. While O'Malley began the delicate process of questioning witnesses, many of whom would be naturally reluctant to talk to police about anything related to the numbers racket, Morrison focused on securing the crime scene and documenting evidence. Standard operating procedure, the kind of methodical police work he'd been trained to perform. That's when the black Cadillac pulled up across the street. 4 men emerged from the luxury vehicle, and Morrison recognized the type immediately. Expensive suits tailored to conceal shoulder holsters, confident movements that suggested men comfortable with violence, hands that instinctively stayed near their waistbands. These were professionals in the truest sense of the word. But it was the 5th man who truly captured Morrison's attention and would haunt his memory for decades to come. Medium height, perhaps 5'8", impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than Morrison made in 3 months. His movements were calm, controlled, almost meditative, as he surveyed the crime scene with the assessing gaze of someone who owned everything he looked upon. Because in the complex economy of Harlem's underworld, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson essentially did own everything he could see. This was Morrison's first glimpse of the man who would define his career. O'Malley noticed the Cadillac's arrival immediately, his experienced cop instincts automatically cataloging the vehicle and its occupants. The older detective had been working Harlem long enough to recognize the significance of that particular car appearing at that particular crime scene. He touched Morrison's shoulder gently. "Son, we need to have a conversation with those gentlemen across the street. But let me do the talking, you understand? This requires a delicate touch." They approached the group with the measured pace of professionals who understood the complex social dynamics at play. Bumpy stood slightly apart from his associates, observing the police investigation with the detached interest of a businessman reviewing a quarterly report. His dark eyes missed nothing. Not the positioning of the bodies, not the reaction of the crowd, not the nervous energy of the 2 approaching police officers. "Good afternoon, Mr. Johnson," O'Malley said with carefully modulated politeness. His tone struck the perfect balance between official authority and community respect. Not friendly enough to suggest corruption, but respectful enough to acknowledge Bumpy's legitimate standing within Harlem's social hierarchy. "Detective O'Malley," Bumpy replied smoothly. His voice carried the educated cadence of someone who'd spent considerable time reading and thinking. Far removed from the street vernacular Morrison had expected from Harlem's most notorious criminal figure. "I trust you gentlemen are making progress with your investigation. We're doing what we can. You wouldn't happen to know anything about what transpired here this afternoon, would you?" Bumpy's response came without hesitation, each word carefully chosen and precisely delivered. "I know that 2 young men who worked for my organization are now dead. I know that whoever orchestrated their murders made a serious tactical error. And I know that errors of this magnitude typically don't repeat themselves." The threat was subtle, but unmistakably clear. Justice would be administered, one way or another, according to the unofficial legal system that governed Harlem's underworld. The question wasn't whether retaliation would occur, but when and in what form. O'Malley nodded slowly, recognizing the coded language that allowed both men to communicate clearly without crossing legal lines that could complicate their respective positions. "Mr. Johnson, I'd appreciate it if your version of justice doesn't create additional work for my department. We've got enough complications already without bodies piling up all over Upper Manhattan." "Detective, my approach to justice has always been surgical in its precision," Bumpy replied with the faintest suggestion of a smile. "I believe in proportional responses that address specific problems without creating broader disruptions to community stability." Morrison watched this entire exchange with growing confusion and mounting unease. His training officer was conversing with a known criminal like they were professional colleagues discussing a mutual business concern. There was genuine respect in the conversation, perhaps even a form of understanding that transcended the traditional adversarial relationship between law enforcement and organized crime. This bothered Morrison considerably more than he'd expected. After Bumpy and his associates departed in their Cadillac, Morrison immediately confronted O'Malley about what he'd witnessed. "Jimmy, why didn't you arrest him? We had probable cause for questioning at minimum." O'Malley studied his young partner with the patient expression of a teacher dealing with a particularly naive student. "Arrest him for what, exactly?" "He's Bumpy Johnson, for Christ's sake. He runs the numbers racket throughout Harlem. He just made a direct threat against whoever killed those two policy runners. We heard him threaten retaliation." "Kid, you've got a tremendous amount to learn about effective police work in communities like this." O'Malley pulled out a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes and lit one with practiced movements. "First point, running numbers isn't murder. Probably 60% of the adults in Harlem play policy regularly. You want me to arrest 60% of our community? But the threat he made, what threat would that be? He said errors don't typically repeat themselves. Could mean he's planning to hire better security for his remaining employees. Could mean he's going to relocate his operations to safer territory. Could mean any number of things that don't involve criminal activity." Morrison remained unconvinced by these explanations. "The man is a career criminal, Jimmy. We both know exactly what he meant by that comment. He's a businessman who operates outside conventional legal frameworks." O'Malley corrected patiently. "There's a significant difference between those two classifications. Bumpy Johnson never harmed anyone who didn't directly threaten his people first. He doesn't sell narcotics to children. He doesn't force anyone to participate in his gambling operations. He provides financial services that legitimate banks won't offer to colored customers. And he protects people that official law enforcement can't always protect." "You sound like you admire the man." O'Malley considered that accusation carefully while taking another drag from his cigarette. "I respect him, Morrison. There's an important distinction between respect and admiration. I respect Bumpy Johnson because he's intelligent, because he honors his commitments, and because when he tells you something will happen, it happens exactly as promised. That doesn't mean I approve of his chosen profession." Morrison couldn't understand this nuanced perspective. In his black and white worldview, criminal behavior was criminal behavior. The law was the law. There shouldn't be gray areas requiring complex moral calculations. 3 weeks later, Morrison's simplistic understanding of good versus evil died along with Detective Jimmy O'Malley. May 3, 1948. 11:20 p.m. Morrison and O'Malley were completing their evening shift when the radio crackled with an urgent call. Shots fired in the alley behind the world-famous Apollo Theater. Possible officer requiring immediate assistance. They found Detective Ray Kowalski pinned down behind a commercial dumpster, taking sustained gunfire from 2 shooters positioned at the far end of the narrow alley. Kowalski had been working deep undercover for 3 months, attempting to infiltrate a narcotics distribution network that had recently established operations in Harlem against Bumpy's explicit territorial claims. "They're white boys from the Bronx," Kowalski shouted, over the continuous gunfire. "Vincent Torino's crew, trying to muscle into the neighborhood. They think I'm connected to Bumpy's organization because I was asking questions about their drug operation. O'Malley quickly assessed the tactical situation. The shooters held superior positioning with better cover and significantly more ammunition than the 3 police officers could match. Standard departmental procedure dictated waiting for backup units to arrive and establish a proper perimeter. But backup was at least 15 minutes away given the late hour and limited patrol coverage in Upper Manhattan. And Torino's gunmen were steadily advancing down the alley, using doorways and fire escapes to improve their shooting angles. O'Malley made the kind of split-second decision that defines a police officer's character under extreme pressure. Morrison, I need you to circle around behind them through the adjacent building. Move fast and stay low. I'll maintain suppressing fire to keep their attention focused on this position. Jimmy, we should wait for backup. This situation is too dangerous. Move now, kid. Kowalski's running out of cover, and those shooters are getting bolder by the minute. Morrison obeyed orders. He was young, athletic, and motivated by absolute trust in his partner's tactical judgment. He made it to the building's rear entrance, climbed 2 flights of stairs, and positioned himself on a fire escape that gave him a clear shot at the gunman's location. The first shot was clean and precise, exactly as he'd been trained at the academy's shooting range. The first gunman dropped instantly. The second shooter immediately turned toward Morrison's new position, abandoning his previous cover to engage this unexpected threat from above. In that crucial moment of distraction, O'Malley saw an opportunity to advance and gain a better shooting angle that could end the confrontation quickly. That's precisely when everything went catastrophically wrong. Morrison had focused entirely on the 2 shooters he could see from his elevated position. What he hadn't noticed, what none of the 3 police officers had detected in the darkness and chaos, was the 3rd member of Torino's crew, hidden in a recessed doorway that provided perfect concealment and an unobstructed view of anyone advancing through the alley. As Morrison engaged the second visible gunman, this hidden shooter had a clear, unimpeded shot at Detective Jimmy O'Malley. 3 rapid shots. Chest, head, professional marksmanship. That ended O'Malley's life instantly. Morrison eliminated the second gunman, wounded the third, and secured the scene according to his training. But Jimmy O'Malley, his mentor, his friend, the man who'd been patiently teaching him the complex realities of police work in urban America, was dead before the ambulance arrived. The subsequent investigation revealed that Vincent Venno Torino was a small-time narcotics dealer from the Bronx who decided to expand his operation into Harlem's lucrative drug market. Torino had systematically approached several of Bumpy's policy runners over the previous months, attempting to recruit them as heroin distributors within the established numbers network. When word of these recruitment efforts reached Bumpy, his response had been characteristically direct and unambiguous. He'd sent Torino a simple message through intermediaries: remove your operation from Harlem immediately, or face the inevitable consequences of territorial violation. Torino had chosen to fight rather than retreat. He'd hired experienced gunmen, acquired military-grade weapons, and formally declared war against Bumpy Johnson's organization throughout Upper Manhattan. The shooting that claimed Jimmy O'Malley's life was a direct result of that declared war. At O'Malley's funeral, Morrison stood beside the detective's widow and 3 young children, listening to department officials deliver speeches about duty, sacrifice, and the thin blue line that separated order from chaos. But Morrison's mind wasn't processing these ceremonial words. He was consumed by one overwhelming thought that would define the next 20 years of his life. If Bumpy Johnson hadn't been operating an illegal gambling empire in Harlem, Vincent Torino would never have attempted to establish a narcotics network in the neighborhood. If Bumpy hadn't initiated territorial warfare against Torino's crew, that alley shootout would never have occurred. If Bumpy Johnson didn't exist, Jimmy O'Malley would still be alive to teach young cops the difference between wrong and evil. Morrison understood intellectually that Torino's gunmen had pulled the triggers. But emotionally, psychologically, Morrison believed that Bumpy Johnson had loaded those weapons and aimed them at his partner. Standing beside O'Malley's grave, Morrison made a solemn vow that would consume his entire career. He would destroy Bumpy Johnson completely and permanently. Morrison immediately requested transfer from patrol duty to the detective division, specifically requesting assignment to organized crime investigations. His captain tried to dissuade him from this obviously emotional decision. "Morrison, you're letting grief and anger drive your career choices. That's incredibly dangerous for any police officer, but especially for detectives who need objective judgment to build effective cases. Jimmy O'Malley died because Bumpy Johnson started a territorial war in our precinct. Jimmy O'Malley died because some punk from the Bronx thought he could muscle into established criminal territory without understanding the consequences. Bumpy Johnson didn't start that conflict. He responded to aggression against his organization." But Morrison wasn't interested in logical analysis or nuanced perspectives. He was motivated purely by rage and the need for vengeance against the man he held responsible for his mentor's death. The first 5 years of Morrison's anti-Bumpy crusade were an absolute disaster from every conceivable perspective. He was too emotional, too obvious in his intentions, too desperate for quick results that would satisfy his need for immediate justice. Morrison harassed Bumpy's associates without probable cause, conducted raids on policy banks without proper warrants, and made arrests that inevitably failed in court because he'd violated constitutional rights while gathering evidence. His investigative methods were so transparently driven by personal vendetta that defense attorneys could easily demonstrate bias and emotional instability that compromised the integrity of his police work. Bumpy initially ignored Morrison entirely, treating him as an annoying but ultimately harmless irritation. Occasionally, Morrison would receive reports that Bumpy had inquired about the young officer who keeps bothering my people, but mostly, Harlem's numbers king seemed to regard Detective Morrison as a minor nuisance that would eventually tire of chasing shadows and move on to more productive activities. That casual dismissal changed dramatically in 1953, when Morrison finally matured as both a detective and a strategic thinker. By 1953, Morrison had transformed himself from an emotional, revenge-driven rookie into a sophisticated detective who understood the fundamental principles of building solid criminal cases. He had learned to be methodical rather than impulsive, patient rather than desperate, and most importantly, he had discovered how to work within constitutional boundaries while still applying maximum pressure to his target. Morrison's new approach represented a complete strategic evolution. Instead of attempting to arrest Bumpy directly, a nearly impossible task given Bumpy's careful insulation from day-to-day criminal activities, Morrison began systematically dismantling the infrastructure that made Bumpy's empire function efficiently. Morrison spent months studying the organizational structure of Harlem's numbers racket with the dedication of a graduate student pursuing a doctorate in criminal sociology. He mapped out the collection routes used by policy runners, identified the locations of counting houses where daily receipts were tallied, traced the money laundering operations that converted illegal gambling profits into legitimate business investments, and documented the elaborate communication networks that allowed Bumpy to coordinate activities across dozens of separate locations throughout Upper Manhattan. Morrison's investigation revealed that Bumpy's organization was far more sophisticated and professionally managed than most legitimate businesses operating in New York City. There were detailed financial records, employee benefit programs, conflict resolution procedures, and quality control systems that ensured consistent service delivery to thousands of regular customers. Most importantly for Morrison's purposes, he discovered that Bumpy's operation depended entirely on a network of mid-level managers and operational supervisors who handled the daily administration of policy banks, collection routes, and customer service operations. These individuals were essential to Bumpy's success, but they lacked the careful legal protection that surrounded Bumpy himself. Morrison began building cases against these mid-level operators, with painstaking attention to constitutional procedure and evidentiary standards. He conducted surveillance operations that documented illegal gambling activities without violating Fourth Amendment protections. He cultivated informants within the organization who could provide testimony about specific criminal acts in exchange for reduced charges on their own cases. He coordinated with federal tax investigators who could pursue income tax evasion charges that were often easier to prove than gambling violations. By 1954, Morrison had successfully arrested and prosecuted 43 individuals associated with Bumpy's organization. Not Bumpy himself, but the managers, supervisors, and specialists who made Bumpy's business operations possible. For the first time since he'd begun investigating Harlem's numbers king, Morrison was having a measurable impact on Bumpy's criminal enterprise. Policy operations were disrupted when key personnel were arrested. Collection routes had to be reorganized when experienced runners were sent to prison. Counting houses were forced to relocate when their locations were compromised by police surveillance. Morrison's systematic pressure campaign was costing Bumpy significant money and operational efficiency. More importantly, from Morrison's perspective, it was finally getting Bumpy Johnson's personal attention. December 15, 1954. Morrison was leaving police headquarters after another 16-hour day of reviewing surveillance reports and preparing arrest warrants when a familiar black Cadillac pulled up to the curb beside him. The passenger window rolled down smoothly. "Detective Morrison," Bumpy Johnson said in his characteristic calm tone, "I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your valuable time for a private conversation." Morrison's right hand instinctively moved toward his service weapon, a reflexive response that didn't go unnoticed by the car's occupant. "Please relax, Detective. If I had intended you any harm, you would already be experiencing it. I simply want to discuss our mutual situation like two professional men who respect each other's capabilities." Morrison paused for several long seconds, weighing the risks and potential benefits of accepting this unexpected invitation. Professional curiosity ultimately won over caution, and he climbed into the passenger seat of the Cadillac. They drove through Harlem's evening streets in thoughtful silence for nearly 10 minutes. Morrison noticed that Bumpy looked older than he remembered from their previous encounter, more worn down by the constant pressures of maintaining his criminal empire against increasingly sophisticated law enforcement efforts. "Detective Morrison, your investigation is having significant financial impact on my business operations," Bumpy finally said, as they passed through Marcus Garvey Park, where this entire conflict had begun 6 years earlier. "That was the general idea," Morrison replied. "Your systematic approach has also created serious hardships for many working people who depend on my organization for their livelihood. Policy runners, numbers writers, counting house operators, security personnel. These are individuals with families to support and bills to pay, just like police officers." Morrison hadn't considered the broader economic implications of his arrests. He'd been focused entirely on damaging Bumpy's organization, without thinking about the collateral impact on the dozens of people who earned legitimate wages from illegitimate gambling operations. "Those people can find legal employment if they're willing to look for it," Morrison said, though his response sounded less convincing than he'd intended. Bumpy smiled without humor. "Detective Morrison, have you ever seriously examined the employment opportunities available to colored workers in New York City? Have you investigated how many legitimate businesses are willing to hire colored employees for positions that pay enough to support a family?" Morrison didn't respond immediately because he knew the answer, and it wasn't comfortable for him to acknowledge. "The numbers racket exists in Harlem," Bumpy continued, "because legitimate economic institutions refuse to serve this community adequately. Banks won't provide loans to colored business owners. Major employers won't hire colored workers for positions with advancement potential. City government won't invest in infrastructure and services that would create legitimate economic opportunities." Bumpy reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila folder. "These documents detail the economic assistance my organization has provided to Harlem families over the past 2 years. Business loans to help people start legitimate enterprises. Medical expense assistance when family members needed surgery or extended hospital care. Educational loans to send promising young people to college or trade schools." Morrison looked at the folder but didn't open it immediately. "I'm not claiming to be a community philanthropist, Detective Morrison. I'm a businessman who operates outside legal boundaries because legal institutions don't adequately serve my community's needs. But when you arrest my employees and disrupt my operations, you're not just enforcing gambling laws, you're destroying the economic support system that keeps hundreds of families stable and productive." Morrison remained silent, processing this perspective that challenged his fundamental assumptions about the relationship between law enforcement and community welfare. "There's something else we need to discuss," Bumpy said, as the Cadillac turned onto the street where Jimmy O'Malley had been killed 6 years earlier. "Your partner's death." Morrison's entire body tensed. This was the wound that had driven every decision he'd made since 1948. Jimmy O'Malley was genuinely respected throughout this community, Bumpy said quietly. He was fair, honest, and he understood that effective policing requires working with people rather than against them. His death was a loss for everyone who lives and works in Harlem. "You caused his death." Vincent Torino caused Detective O'Malley's death. "I responded to Torino's aggressive invasion of my territory, but I didn't create the situation that brought Torino to Harlem in the first place. If you weren't running illegal gambling operations, Torino wouldn't have seen an opportunity to establish drug distribution networks in this neighborhood. Detective Morrison, if I wasn't controlling gambling activities in Harlem, someone else would be. Someone potentially much worse than me. Do you want to see what this community would look like if criminal enterprises were managed by people like Vincent Torino? People who sell narcotics to children, who use violence indiscriminately, who have no investment in community stability." Morrison stared out the window at the exact location where his partner had been ambushed. The pain was still fresh after 6 years, but Bumpy's words were forcing him to consider perspectives he'd never allowed himself to explore. "I understand your anger, Detective. If someone killed my closest associate, my most trusted friend, I would want revenge as much as you do. But Jimmy O'Malley wouldn't want his death to become the reason you destroyed the economic foundation of the community he was trying to protect." The Cadillac stopped outside Morrison's apartment building in Washington Heights, far from the Harlem streets where both men conducted their professional activities. "Detective Morrison," Bumpy said, as Morrison prepared to exit the vehicle. "You're an exceptional police officer, much better than most of your colleagues. You could accomplish tremendous good for this community if you weren't so completely focused on destroying me. Consider what Detective O'Malley would want you to do with the remainder of your career." Morrison left the car without responding, but he took Bumpy's folder with him. That evening, Morrison sat at his kitchen table and carefully reviewed every document in Bumpy's folder. Business loan agreements with detailed repayment schedules, medical expense receipts for surgeries, hospital stays, and prescription medications, educational loan documentation for young people attending colleges, trade schools, and professional training programs throughout the metropolitan area. The financial assistance detailed in those documents was staggering in both scope and scale. Bumpy Johnson's organization had provided more direct economic support to Harlem families in the previous year than all city social service agencies combined. Morrison spent the following week independently verifying every entry in Bumpy's documentation. He interviewed loan recipients, visited businesses that had been started with Bumpy's financing, spoke with families whose medical crises had been addressed through Bumpy's assistance programs. Every single entry was completely accurate. Every family confirmed receiving exactly the assistance documented in Bumpy's records. Every business owner acknowledged the startup capital that had made their success possible. Morrison was confronted with an uncomfortable truth that challenged everything he believed about criminal justice and community welfare. Bumpy Johnson's illegal gambling empire was providing essential social services that legitimate institutions were failing to provide. But acknowledging that reality didn't change the fundamental fact that Jimmy O'Malley was dead, and Morrison still held Bumpy responsible for creating the conditions that led to his partner's murder. Morrison made a strategic decision that would define the next phase of his investigation. He would continue pursuing Bumpy Johnson, but with a completely different approach. Instead of simply trying to destroy Bumpy's organization, Morrison would study it comprehensively. He would learn exactly how it functioned, why it had developed, what social needs it satisfied, and what would replace it if it were successfully eliminated. Morrison essentially became an academic researcher specializing in Bumpy Johnson's criminal enterprise. He read everything available about Bumpy's personal background, his rise to power in Harlem's underworld, his business philosophy and operational methods. He interviewed former associates who had left the organization and were willing to discuss their experiences, He studied academic literature about illegal gambling, urban sociology, economic development in minority communities, and the relationship between law enforcement and social welfare in major American cities. Morrison's research revealed that Bumpy had been shaped by exactly the same experiences that influenced many Harlem residents: systematic economic discrimination, limited educational opportunities, exclusion from legitimate business networks, and the necessity of creating alternative economic systems when conventional institutions failed to serve community needs. Morrison learned that Bumpy's organization operated according to strict ethical codes that prohibited violence against civilians, drug dealing to minors, and coercive recruitment of unwilling participants in gambling activities. Morrison discovered that Bumpy was widely respected throughout Harlem, not despite being a criminal, but precisely because he was a criminal who used his illegal power to protect and strengthen his community rather than exploit and weaken it. Most significantly for Morrison's personal development, he realized that his 6-year obsession with hunting Bumpy Johnson was teaching him more about his own community, his own profession, and his own motivations than 2 decades of conventional police work could ever have provided. By 1958, exactly 10 years after Jimmy O'Malley's death, Morrison had become the New York Police Department's acknowledged expert on organized crime in Harlem. Not just Bumpy's specific organization, but the entire parallel economy of illegal enterprises that existed alongside the legitimate business community throughout Upper Manhattan. Morrison's analytical reports were studied by federal law enforcement agencies, referenced by sociologists researching urban poverty and community development, and consulted by city planning officials trying to understand the complex relationship between legal and illegal economic activities in minority neighborhoods. Morrison was developing a national reputation as a thoughtful, sophisticated detective who understood criminal behavior from sociological, economic, and political perspectives that went far beyond traditional law and order approaches to urban crime. But despite all this professional recognition and intellectual growth, Morrison still hadn't arrested Bumpy Johnson, and increasingly, he was beginning to question whether arresting Bumpy would actually serve the interests of justice or community welfare. In 1963, after serving 11 years in federal prison at Alcatraz, Bumpy Johnson returned to Harlem. Morrison, now promoted to lieutenant and supervising a team of detectives investigating organized crime throughout Manhattan, expected Bumpy's return to trigger widespread violence, as he attempted to reclaim territory that had been absorbed by competing criminal organizations during his absence. Instead, Morrison observed something that surprised and impressed him. Bumpy methodically negotiated agreements that restored his control over Harlem's numbers racket without creating the bloodshed that Morrison had anticipated. Morrison watched Bumpy eliminate Marcus Smooth Henderson, who had betrayed Bumpy's interests during his imprisonment, but accomplished this through strategic intimidation and forced exile rather than murder. Morrison witnessed Bumpy rebuild his organization using exactly the same principles he had employed before his federal conviction: strict operational codes, community investment, and strategic alliances that prioritized neighborhood stability over short-term profit maximization. Morrison realized that Bumpy Johnson, at 58 years old, was fundamentally the same man he had been at 43. Federal prison hadn't changed his methods, his philosophy, or his commitment to managing illegal activities in ways that served community interests rather than undermining them. What had changed during those 11 years was Morrison's understanding of what Bumpy represented and what his elimination might mean for Harlem's social and economic stability. Morrison began seriously considering a question that would have been unthinkable when he started his investigation. Would arresting Bumpy Johnson actually improve law enforcement effectiveness, or would it create chaos that would ultimately harm the community Morrison was sworn to protect?